One of the most famous analyses of religious statements came from Antony Flew with his parable of the gardener. Flew imagines two explorers who come to a garden in a jungle clearing. One says that there must be a gardener who maintains it, the other is skeptical. So they set a watch and they don't see a gardener. And the believer says, the gardener must be invisible. So they use bloodhounds, thermal cameras, tripwires, all kinds of methods of detection, and they never find a gardener. And every time the believer says, the gardener can't be smelled or seen on thermal cameras, but he is there. And eventually the skeptic says, look, if there's a gardener, but they're invisible and they can't be smelled and they can't be detected in any way, then how is that really different from what I'm saying, which is that there is no gardener?
Let's go over the gardener analogy. It's the idea that somebody's claiming, okay, look, out in that garden out there, or out in the woods out there, those woods are woods that are maintained, right? They're not just there accidentally. They're kind of designed in a certain way. And there's a great gardener. This is the analogy. There's a great gardener who takes care of those woods. But then, every time somebody sets out to try to go empirically verify if there's a gardener there, right, there's always this response like, well, the gardener is invisible. And also, okay, so then I've set up thermal cameras. Well, actually, the gardener can't be detected with thermal cameras. And, actually, the gardener can't be, heard or smelled or really sensed in any way. It's just this purely immaterial gardener who, cannot be empirically verified. And yet, nonetheless, the gardener's there. So this word on the screen here, unfalsifiable. This would be kind of, this would be the charge against a claim like that. It's what's called an unfalsifiable premise. And what does that mean, an unfalsifiable premise? That means it's a premise that there's no counter evidence you could provide, to falsify. There's no evidence I could show you and say, therefore your claim is false. It's a premise that's just kind of naturally insulated against, any real criticism. And the idea, especially in things like modern science, is that this is always, this should always be regarded as a sort of, dead on arrival kind of claim. Something that's unfalsifiable like that is sort of DOA. Because if it cannot be verified, if it cannot be falsified, then it cannot be verified. And if it cannot be either falsified or verified, then it doesn't seem to actually have any rational value. So obviously the claim, and why Anthony Flew is a famous atheist, and why that claim is being made, is because the charge would be essentially that this is the claim that people are making about God. That they're essentially claiming there is this agent out there that is, the creator of everything and is intervening in things, but there's no way you can sense this creator. There's no way you can verify it. They're effectively invisible to all senses. There's no evidence you could provide. And therefore, the atheist charge would be that makes the theism claim as unfalsifiable as this mysterious invisible gardener claim. So I believe that an argument like that, you hear that kind of rhetoric from atheists commonly. And I believe that kind of rhetoric is very commonly based in just a simple misunderstanding about theology, and especially when we're talking about classical theism. And in particular, that misunderstanding, and this is getting into a little bit what my YouTube video idea was, that I might be doing a more shorter form YouTube video for, which is it's this basic category error that people tend to commonly make, especially people who don't believe in God. They tend to make this category error when they're thinking and talking about God. And I mean God with a capital G. So a category error, it's not a strict formal logical fallacy. It's almost more of an ontological fallacy. Ontology is the philosophy of being. So it's miscategorizing something, right? So it's when you're treating something as belonging to a different kind of thing than it actually does. Now, how would that be relevant here? That would be relevant here in the sense that what an atheist might commonly do is treat God with a capital G as if God with a capital G belonged into the same category as gods with a lowercase g. Now, what's the difference? Well, gods with a lowercase g, these would be like pagan polytheistic gods, like the ancient Greek gods, Zeus and Hades, like the Norse gods, Odin and Thor. Like many cultures have countless different pantheons of lowercase gods. And this is often the way that I think a lot of skeptics tend to treat God with a capital G. This God with a capital G is just another one of those. But the problem is those lowercase g gods, they are what would be considered finite and contingent things in being. They're finite. They're not infinite, and they're not eternal. Almost all the lowercase g gods have their own little story of how they were created, right? Like the Greek gods were originate from the Titans, right? And I'm not super big on mythology, but you have like the Norse gods who originate from like the Jotunheim and the giants, and there's a whole story as to how they're created. So these lowercase g gods are created things. They're not eternal. They haven't always been, and they might not always be. Sometimes they suffer from deicide, or they end up killed in ways. They're not infinite. They're not all powerful. They may be far more powerful than a human being, but they're not all powerful. They're not infinite in that regard, and they're not necessary. They're contingent. There's nothing about them that has to exist. Their existence is not self-sufficient and necessary. It depends on external things, right? And that just really makes them like a super powerful version of the same kind of being a human being is, essentially. Now, God with a capital G is infinite and necessary. Infinite and necessary. What does that mean? Infinite as in has no beginning, has no end, is eternal, is literally like the sideways 8 infinity. Literally cannot be comprehended in finite terms, temporally or spatially. And likewise, is therefore necessary. There is no cause of God with a capital G. These other lowercase g gods are caused by things, right? That's what their origin stories will describe, as the way they were, the way they had things causally give rise to them. But God with a capital G is not caused by anything. The essence of God with a capital G is simply existence, whereas gods with a lowercase g are things in existence. I'm probably going to have a YouTube video on this explaining it further, but that's generally the category error. Is people call, or they will miscategorize the capital G God, like God with a capital G, and they'll miscategorize it as a lowercase g pagan god. And this is, I think, what results in a lot of things, because here's the thing: in that invisible gardener analogy he just gave, that invisible gardener is a finite contingent being. That invisible gardener would be like a spirit or a god with a lowercase g of like ancient mythology, a finite and contingent thing that doesn't explain itself, that relies on other things to explain its existence. Meanwhile, God with a capital G would not function like that at all. So already we're kind of coming at this. The standards of evidence you're going to use to prove the existence of something, those only even make sense if you're talking about a finite object in being. How do you know if a finite object in being exists? Well, you go empirically verify it, is usually the most common way. But we're not talking about a finite object in being. We're talking about an infinite necessary standard of being itself. So it's simply a category error. A lot of these, you hear there's things like the flying spaghetti monster. The flying spaghetti monster, you've probably heard that before. That's another, maybe we'll watch a short clip on it or something. But that's another common way of engaging in this category error. It's the same kind of thing. Where it's evoking some kind of a finite contingent object in being, and then treating it as if it's in any way analogous to God with a capital G, which it's not. So already just so many of these analogies are flawed. But I've kind of rambled enough on that point for now. I promised myself I'd get better about rambling, but oh well. Let's continue.
Philosopher R.M. Hare has an interesting reply. He tells a story about a lunatic who is absolutely convinced that all university dons want to murder him. His friends try to introduce him to nice dons, and he says, no, they're just lying to lull me into a false sense of security. There's absolutely no evidence that can convince this guy. His belief is completely unfalsifiable. And so, according to Flew, he's not really saying anything about university dons at all, because no matter what we tell him about them, his belief doesn't change. So what is he really saying? Hare says that what he's expressing is a blick, which is a word Hare made up. Blicks are not so much beliefs as they are ways of looking at the world. There's no evidence that can convince this guy, so his blick is more about assessing what does and doesn't count as evidence and what is worth paying attention to. As another example...
Okay, I already have some problems with this. First of all, at least the way he described... Now, I'll confess this much. I have not read Hare. So he's citing something I haven't myself read, so that always warrants transparency up front. But the way he just described it, a blick literally would be a belief. Like, the way he just described that, a blick would be a belief held in somebody's mind. It's just the issue would seem to be based on the example he just gave, the issue would be an issue of justification. So for those who don't know, the classic definition of knowledge is justified true belief. This originates with Plato in his dialogue on Theaetetus. And it's those three elements together. It's when you have a belief in your mind, that belief happens to be true by whichever standard of truth you're using, and it's not just that it's merely true, but it's also held with justification. Now, justification means having a good rational basis grounding your belief in rationality, a good reason for believing it to be true. So what does that mean? So like a lucky guess. Somebody could just lucky guess. If I say, what card is on the top of this deck of cards? You said, I don't know, the 2 of clubs, that you just took a guess, and I turned it over, and there's a 1 in 52 chance you got it right. And what do you know? 1 out of 52 chance you got it right. It actually was the 2 of clubs. Could you say that before I turned the card over, though, that you knew it was the 2 of clubs? No. Even though your belief it's the 2 of clubs was technically true, before I turned it over, you didn't actually have a good reason to believe it. So you were missing the justification element of belief. Or, I'm sorry, of knowledge. So that's the classic definition of knowledge, right? Justified true belief. So based on what he just said about a blick, now again, I haven't read this guy Hare, so I'm just going on what this guy here is, the description he's giving. But the way he literally just described it, a blick absolutely would be a belief. It would be a belief. It's just the issue, and the issue wouldn't even necessarily be its truth, because I don't know, it could be true that... Also, I'm having a hard time hearing what he's saying. It sounds like he's saying dons of university. I think he's trying to say deans. Maybe it's a British thing. I don't know. But if all these university faculty are out to trying to kill him, I mean, that could be true, right? It's not really an issue of whether it's true or false. The issue with that example he just gave would be, the issue would seem to have more to do with justification. The issue would seem to have more to do with the fact that somebody with a blick, it seems like their belief isn't actually attached to any justification theory, and therefore it's just kind of this arbitrary belief, right? So I'm just pointing that out because I'm already taking issue with the way he's explaining this. It's striking me as a little weird. But notice he is continuing to circle back to this idea of an unfalsifiable belief, which is a little bit confirming my earlier suspicions of him. My earlier suspicions of him being, that there's a certain atheistic assumption going in to how he's thinking about what God is and what a premise like God exists means. And he's holding it to evidential standards that would only be applicable to a different category of thing, like a lowercase g God or some other thing in being rather than being itself. And I think he's kind of continuing to give himself away there, because he seems to continue to be fixating on this idea that believing a proposition like God with a capital G exists is in some way an unfalsifiable claim. Right? It's in some way an unfalsifiable hypothesis. But like I said, that already is kind of, it's just a category error to think of it that way. And his blick example is certainly a bit weird, the way he described it. But let's continue.
take the idea everything that happens for a reason, even if we don't know it. This is completely unfalsifiable. You couldn't begin to find evidence against this idea, or even, I think, for it, actually, because it's completely consistent with anything happening or not happening. And yet,
not necessarily.
Somebody who says this is looking at the world differently from somebody who doesn't say it. And that difference is what the idea of Blix tries to capture.
No, I'm sorry. Again, I don't. Maybe it's good because it's part 2. I'm sorry to pause frequently. What the hell was that? He says this is a belief that he's trying to call this a blick. Everything that happens for a reason, even if we don't know it. I think that's highly debatable whether that's a blick or not. I mean, here's the thing: is somebody could say reason is equivalent to like a cause, in which case you could try to convert this to a proposition like everything that exists must have a cause for its existence. Or there's something that there's something a philosopher by the name of Leibniz came up with called the principle of sufficient reason, that everything must have a sufficient reason for its existence. Now it's using the word happen, but happen would seem to imply an event or a change, a causal change in time, which itself would it would be an instantiation of motion or change in being, which is a process of becoming, which is a process of coming into being, which is a process of existing. And so either which way, I would say this just seems like another more casual way of saying like everything that exists must have a cause for its existence, or everything must have a sufficient reason for its existence. And that is absolutely, I would not call that a blick at all. Like he made it sound like there's really no evidence you could provide one way or the other. I think he's just wrong there, because it would seem, and some people might point to things like quantum physics and whatnot, and like how particles pop in and out of existence, at least theoretically, and say that actually refutes the idea that everything must have a cause for its existence. But also, these are actually, and again, I wonder if it's an atheistic bias coming out, because these are actually sometimes the bases for arguments for God, right? That this is the Kalam cosmological argument. This is basically its first premise. Everything that exists must have a cause for its existence. The universe began to exist, therefore the universe has a cause for its existence. And then there's subsequent arguments given as to why that cause would have all these properties of like God with a capital G. Well, I guess it wouldn't be properties, and they would just be what God is, because God doesn't have properties other than himself. Otherwise, he wouldn't be God, and that gets into some complicated metaphysics and theology. But basically, there's also the principle of sufficient reason, which is used to argue to the existence of a necessary being, a being that's not contingent in its existence but is necessary. And remember, that's what we were talking about. It's one of the problems with like gods with a lowercase g are contingent. God with a capital G is necessary. But whether it would seem there's absolutely evidence you can give to confirm one of those, that proposition over its contrary, that everything, you must have a sufficient reason for its existence, or everything must have a cause for its existence, or even just put more simply, that everything happens for a reason. That would absolutely seem there's reasons you can give, and there are absolutely arguments and reasons regularly given for that, and they're used to infer further things. So I just find what he just said to be an absolutely radical and out of this, like just out of left field statement that just struck me as a surprisingly off base for a fellow philosopher. But anyway, we'll continue here.
Somebody who says this is looking at the world differently from somebody who doesn't say it. And that difference is what the idea of Blix tries to capture. Part 2. Life, finds a way. Now, you don't have to buy into the existence of Blix wholesale, but I think the general point that Hare's trying to make here is one that a lot of people have made. Namely, that there's more to religion than just believing things to be true. As an example, let's imagine that you are a member...
Sorry, there's more to religion than just believing things to be true. I want to see what he has to say about this.
Things to be true. As an example, let's imagine that you are a member of the Russian Orthodox Church in the final years of the Russian Empire. When you go to church, there's the sound of bells and chanting. There's the smells of the incense, the candlelight flickering over the icons and the gold. The inside of Russian Orthodox churches are beautiful. probably go with your whole family. And when you go, you pray for the souls of your ancestors who went to the Orthodox Church before you.
Right.
So there's a real connection to family and tradition there.
Right.
Maybe you're aware that the Bolshevik revolutionaries are very anti-religion, so when you go to church there might be some political sentiments mixed up in there as well.
Yeah.
The prayers that you're saying are circular, chanted, almost meditative. There's so much more going on there than just turning up and saying, I believe that X, Y, and Z are true. The day-to-day experience of having faith is and Z are more going on there than just turning up and saying, I believe that X, Y, and Z are true.
Okay. So there's like kind of almost two different things he's saying here. And it's actually very interesting what he's talking about, because depending on how to interpret what he's saying, I could possibly agree with him. But depending on how to interpret what he's saying, I could absolutely possibly disagree with him. Because the way it's probably a matter of he's phrasing it in a weird way, because he's phrasing it like it's this issue of just mere truth. And so he's saying, well, if there are these aesthetic and artistic and familial and social and these like deeply personal and emotional reasons why somebody goes to church, which by the way is true, right? That I think absolutely all of that stuff is caught up in religious belief. I will push back a little bit on the idea that it's like that's in some way intrinsic to religion specifically. I don't think that at all. I think that's actually deeply tied up to a lot of different worldviews and belief systems and ideologies people have, right? That they believe things for reasons that are not necessarily based in evidence of anything or the most rational thinking, but is based in emotional intuition and family connection. And this goes far beyond religion, the political ideology that somebody believes. What do you know? Statistically, by far the number one biggest predictor of somebody's political beliefs is what their parents' political beliefs were, right? But not just political ideology. But things like I used the example of veganism earlier, all kinds of things. It's not something that can be simply reduced down to a series of true false claims about reality, right? About necessarily what's most justified to believe is true about reality, that's the metaphysical layer that religion engages with, that other like less quote unquote religious philosophies and ethical views engage in. So basically, if what he's saying is just simply religions don't all involve a series of metaphysical claims and judgments and evaluations rationally about metaphysics, I agree with him. It involves aesthetics. He was describing a lot of aesthetics, right? These evaluative elements of the experience of going to church. Aesthetics is a philosophy of perceptive value, or the value of experience. So things like art or the philosophy of beauty, you could call it. It's kind of like ethics, but when ethics applies value, if ethics applies value to human behavior, aesthetics applies value to human perception and human experience. So aesthetics, he was describing a lot of like aesthetic values that go into it, a lot of aesthetic factors and social factors, your family, your culture, even political factors. There's even a intersection of religion and political philosophy. So I would agree with him. Religion is not something that just simply serves a metaphysical role. But the problem is he's phrasing it very weirdly and in a very different way than that. He's not just simply talking. He's actually describing it like religion's just not about what's true. Okay, but here's the problem. Is all of those things he just described about aesthetics, all of those things he just described about society and culture and family, those are all themselves truth claims. Is it true that this person finds there to be something aesthetically valuable about going to church? Is it true that this person finds something to be familially and socially valuable and relevant about going to church? Is it true? These are all truth claims, right? Like there's still things that are true, and there's still value judgments, truth evaluations that this person is engaging in. They're not doing it in the same way you like sit there and might like construct logical arguments, to deal with the metaphysics of the religious belief. It's a different kind of thing they're engaging in, but there's still a truth they're assessing. And of course, one could think of truth as just simply one and the same with things like goodness and beauty and oneness and being. This is actually Aristotle's classic 5 transcendental categories. It's almost just different modes of the same thing. So I'm really disagreeing with the way he's framing this as like an issue of religion just doesn't have to do with truth. And again, I think it's because he's trying to make this argument that it has to do with he views a proposition like God exists as an unfalsifiable proposition, which I think I've already said, I think he's just blatantly wrong about. But I think that is a bias that's influencing a lot of the way he's talking about this. Anyway, let's get back to it.
The world is round, but they quickly realise he's mad and lock him up. And what Kierkegaard was saying is that you can have all the facts and all the truths and still be wrong, because you haven't appreciated the context in which those facts matter.
That's interesting. You could have all the facts and all the truth and still be wrong because you don't appreciate the context in which they matter. I would like to know exactly what the hell he means by that. Because arguably the context is just a broader web of true beliefs, right? Arguably the context is just an additional system of truth values. And which would seem to run counter to what he's saying. So what exactly does he mean by context? Is he pointing to those things he was talking about earlier, right? The aesthetic value of going to church, these social and cultural and political factors that factor into why people believe the things they do and do the things they do, because those are arguably all still reducible to propositions with truth value. But reacts. Let's continue.
And the writers are often more to do with how they interpret facts and what facts they care about. There is nobody for whom all facts are equally important. There is nobody for whom all information...
Now I think I see what he's doing. Sorry to pause it again quickly, but now I think I see what he's doing. So he's bringing this idea that what is being... So truth is an evaluation, right? But so is goodness, so is beauty, so is importance. And so he's bringing in this idea that a belief is not necessarily going to always be strictly evaluated along the lines of whether or not it's simply true or false, right? But he's trying to say, but there's this additional layer of evaluating it along the lines of whether it's an important belief or not. And the problem is, though, that important belief would be importance would be an axiological structure, right? And axiology is a philosophy of value. So importance would be a hierarchy of the value you're assigning to these different beliefs. But the thing is, such an axiological system itself requires a series of truth values. Like, is it true that this is important to me? That is a truth claim. There's no such thing as a claim you can make that is not in of itself a truth claim just by virtue of the fact that you said it. Okay, so there's something called truth predicate redundancy. Now, truth predicate redundancy comes to this idea, like if you take a statement, I think the famous example is the roses are beautiful or something. Or let's just say the roses smell, I don't know, the roses are beautiful. That's the statement. Now, so in that statement, the subject, so in a proposition, if you say all X are Y, the subject is X, the predicate is Y. So in that statement, the subject is roses, these roses, and the predicate is beautiful. These roses are beautiful, right? The predicate is something you predicate of the subject. It's something you affirm the subject as. Now take that statement, the roses are beautiful, and make that entire statement now itself the subject and make truth the predicate. So the way that would look is you take this statement, the roses are beautiful, and you turn that into the statement, it is true that the roses are beautiful. It is true that the roses are beautiful. And then now ask the question, what does that second statement add? What new information does it add that the previous statement did not contain? Does that second statement, does saying it is true the roses are beautiful say anything more than the statement the roses are beautiful? And the answer is no, it doesn't. The roses are beautiful already has a truth value that you're defining and affirming as true just by saying the roses are beautiful. And therefore, to predicate it as true and to actually spell out it is true that the roses are beautiful is itself um, it's just redundant. The truth predicate is redundant. That's what that means. That's what it's called, truth predicate redundancy. It is literally redundant to sit there and say it is true the roses are beautiful when to just simply say the roses are beautiful is to accomplish that same thing. It's to affirm the proposition as true. So all propositions, all statements, simply by virtue of being intelligible and coherent statements, necessarily contain a truth value, even an evaluative one. And that's why the roses are beautiful is a good example, because that's an evaluation. That's an aesthetic value, beauty. So you're evaluating the roses are beautiful as a true statement. You're saying it is true that there is an aesthetic value called beauty I can affix to these roses. So if you take some other axiological claim, and in this case, let's take importance, because that's what he's talking about, right? That there are beliefs that you evaluate as true and false, but then you also evaluate those beliefs in terms of how important they are to you. And he's trying to act like that's something different from the truth itself. And that's finally the explanation I think we're starting to piece together of what he means when he says, I don't think religion is about truth claims or true and false statements. But the problem is, again, even all of those claims, any claim you would make about the importance of a belief, just by making the claim, this belief is important to me, you have necessarily affirmed that claim as true. You have made a truth claim. You're not getting out of making truth claims just because you're moving into some axiological category like importance.
And that's where is equally valuable and action guiding. And to pretend that anybody is like that is to run the risk of being a little bit like Kierkegaard's madman. All of this is not to dismiss science or truth or any popular atheist talking points. I just wanted to teach this material with a bit of a different spin than I have.
It's not? Well, I mean, I agree it's not. But that's because I think you're pushing an atheist narrative. So of course it's not to dismiss atheism. You're kind of like coming from an assumed atheist perspective. So it's just a weird claim to squeeze in there.
I haven't seen on YouTube before. I'm not throwing truth out or disparaging the truth or being a Marxist Illuminati SJW cultural relativist, okay?
You're literally disregarding. You're literally acting like truth claims aren't truth claims at the same time that they're truth claims. Which sounds weird to say, but that's actually what you're doing.
I don't believe in the truth of any religion's central claims, and so I don't personally see the point for me.
Sorry. I'm sorry to keep pausing, but finally, I will give him credit for at least stating that clearly at the end. So just to kind of vindicate me a little bit. Now you know I'm not crazy. Remember, what did I say from the beginning of this video? I'm 99% sure this guy is assuming an atheist perspective, and that's informing the way he's talking about it. Well, what did he just say?
I don't believe in the truth of any religion's central claims.
I don't believe in the truth of any religion's central claims. He just said I'm an atheist. So, kudos to me. I called it, right? I called that from the beginning of the video before he ever admitted anything like that.
And so I don't personally see the point for me of living those questions, but it's still cool to appreciate other people's viewpoints. And all I'm doing is inviting you to the idea that for people who have faith, there's more going on there. I'm sure YouTube will appreciate and understand the nuance of that position. I'll be interested to hear from people of all faiths and none.
YouTube's not the most understanding place.
In the comments. If you liked today's lesson, I have a tip.
Alright. Well, that was an interesting little video.